Here to help with your wanderlust. This is Banter Bollywood and Beyond, talking about Satyajit Ray's The Stranger. Hello Smita.
Hello Alex.
Hi everybody.
Hello everyone.
So welcome to another episode of Banter Bollywood and Beyond. And this one is well and truly beyond because we are talking about Satyajit Ray's last film, which is called The Stranger. And we haven't covered any Satyajit Ray films before on this podcast. We've talked about him a lot, he's been mentioned, but this is the first time that we're covering one of his films. It's also a first in that it's the first non-Hindi film, the first Bengali film that we are talking about on this podcast. And this was my choice. I usually alternate between a Bollywood banger and a non-Bollywood film. And this was my non-Bollywood film. So the next time I do an episode, it will definitely be more Bollywoody. But I've wanted to choose something that was a little bit different to the usual, and also to choose something that was outside of regular Hindi cinema. And what better way to do that than to pick the one Indian director that most Western audiences know, which is Satyajit Ray. And it was interesting that this film was on Mubi, because obviously Mubi is meant for big films that are, quite underground, important films, and obviously you'd expect Satyajit Ray's films to be on there. And we've watched two of his films before, you and me. We've watched The Adversary, which was about a man having trouble finding jobs in Calcutta, and The Expedition, which was a sort of almost like a western, like a sort of very rural-based thriller kind of thing of his. But this was an entirely different thing. So, first things first, before we get into too much detail, had you heard of this film before? Never? Do you I know that you get lots of Bollywood films on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever get the odd Bengali film on TV?
Yeah, every Sunday, Doordarshan, which is national broadcast of, equivalent of BBC, BBC One, BBC Four, used to be in the afternoon at 1:30 that they would play only regional movies, never Hindi movies, never. At 1:30 after lunch.
Okay.
And so yes, a lot of times we have seen, most of it would be Bengali only for some reason.
Yes.
Some would be in South Indian languages, some in and Marathi.
But mostly Bengali films.
Yeah, because Bengali was the only other active, cultural, creative sector at that time.
Yes.
Making movies on social realism and all that. So that is where also, that was the important thing. Otherwise, South Indians were making movies, but they were a little bit actually they were also making commercial movies at that time. So yeah, South Indians and Bengali language. So South Indian meaning Telugu and Tamil.
Yes, and the odd Bengali film. And did you ever watch those films?
I remember mostly the Telugu and Tamil, but I can't remember their names now.
Sure.
Because they were not really based on village life. Because again, South Indian film industry is very different than Bengali film industry.
Oh yeah, sure.
They are also obsessed about, middle class, urban sort of themes more than, a rural life.
Yeah,
even if
sure.
they show rural life, it will be interspersed with lots of urban sort of, informal, slum sort of life rather than just purely rural rhythm.
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, this one was a very, very urban film, but it was punctuated by this idea of rural life, which is a very important aspect of the film, for sure. Now, before we get into too much detail, let's just do a little synopsis of the film. So the story is quite simple, really. So Anita Bose, who's the matriarch, the female head of this family in Calcutta, is reading a letter at the very beginning of the film. She's reading a letter that purports to be from her long lost uncle, and her long lost uncle is someone who left her when she was about 2 years old, so she remembers absolutely nothing about him. And the letter is written in beautiful, flowery Bengali, which she doesn't expect him to be able to write because he left and travelled around the world and has a very sort of non-Indian life up to this point. So she's quite amazed that he can speak very good, well, he can write beautiful Bengali. And the husband is a little bit cautious about this because, firstly, as you would rightly be, how do you know that this person is going to be your actual uncle? And secondly, this person is actually planning to visit them in Calcutta. And the reasons that he gives for this are not very clear, but he decides to come and visit them and be welcomed by them. And the daughter is naturally, well, not the daughter, sorry, Anita is naturally very sort of confused about this, because on the one hand she wants to meet her uncle, but on the other hand she doesn't know if she can trust if this guy is real or not. But she agrees to welcome him in for a little bit just to see how it goes. And if he's not the correct person, she says she can sweep him out of the door with her broom, which I thought was a very nice line. And the stranger himself is played by Utpal Dutt, who comes to visit. And a lot of the film is about, firstly, whether or not this stranger is who he says he is. Secondly, how he manages to share his lifestyle, his view of the world with the other people in the household and the friends and connected people. And thirdly, also about his plans of why exactly has he come to visit? Why has he chosen this moment and this time? And that's really the big crux of the story, although there is also a lot of very interesting development about urban life and rural life. Did you pick up on any other themes or any big ideas of this film?
Well, I like that fact because I'm an anthropologist, so this is one of the rare opportunities where, Indians are shown to be actively interested in anthropology.
Yes.
And not just India's but also international, in Latin America.
Yes.
And his knowledge about other ethnic groups, indigenous groups around the world and in India as well.
Yes,
and
who
so
we see.
I liked that as well. I related with it, and I really appreciate that,
Yes.
it was picked up very well.
And yes, and Utpal Dutt's character does say that he's an anthropologist. And also we do actually see the Cole tribe in the later scene of the film, which is quite an important scene, but we won't spoiler it, But we do actually get to see him being an anthropologist with the tribe, essentially. So a little bit of background as well into this film. Now, this is Satyajit Ray's final film, and he died not long after. He died about a year after this film was released. And he was not in a very good physical condition when he made this film. In fact, he'd had a heart attack when he was making one of his previous films in 1983, so about 8 years before this film was released. And he essentially directed this from an oxygen tent. He was not in a very good state. Having said that, because it is his last film, it is quite an important film because he had a huge career. So it's been about 40 years of making movies up to this point. And it's based on a story that he wrote, a short story that he wrote before, but he hadn't made into an actual film. So, what did you like about this film, firstly?
I think that it was unique, obviously, unlike most of his other movies about rural life. So I like the fact that he picked up and the austerity of the house, I mean, it was very plain and simple house, and the artifacts were shown, and those
Oh yes.
antique pieces that I really liked. His choices of mattress and all that. I mean, it was wonderful. That showed that this guy definitely has traveled in big museums outside of India, and
He understood
as well as he's aware about antique markets around that time in India as well.
Yes.
So that was good.
He's aware of the importance of the internal life of these characters, these Calcutta characters, and that's quite interesting because we haven't really covered a film that's set in a different city before, and obviously people in Calcutta have quite different social mannerisms to people in Mumbai, who we've covered quite a lot of before. I quite like that. You mentioned the word, correct me in my pronunciation here, Bhadralok.
Bhadralok, yeah.
Bhadralok. And you mentioned that in response to how the city people welcome Utpal Dutt's character, who is deliberately contrasted with them because he's quite simple in his dress and quite relaxed in his dress, whereas the family themselves are very formal and very mannered in their behaviour, very, almost posh in their behaviour. So for the benefit of our Western listeners and for me, what is a Bhadralok?
So they are basically supposed to be mostly upper caste, or may not be financially well off, but will enjoy higher status as educated, scholarly, literary person. Typically, people like Satyajit Ray himself.
Yes.
But they will always be dressed also in very ethnic outfits.
Okay.
And they will be also gentlemanly. They will talk very
definitely.
politely. They will never get anxious or agitated with any harsh criticism.
Yes.
Or argue back in a very, aggressive way.
Oh, definitely.
They will never be, they will be offensive. They are kind of passive aggressive in that sense.
Sure.
But this is what internet is telling me, and it is what says that it is. It is sort of seeped over all the political parties in Bengal, both left and right.
Yes.
But for me, basically, they're just urban elites. Even though in Bengal, of course, capitalism basically is defunct concept. It never was. I have absolutely no idea what the left politics is really meant for, because there is no job in Bengal. It's a very different version of capital and industrial worker struggle.
Sure.
I mean, they're still stuck in that sort of colonial setting of industrial life, but in modern corporate post-colonial setting, they absolutely, I think it's just completely a vague concept. But
Yes.
I don't know if Bhadralok still works, if it is still, there's any ounce of corporate India, post-colonial corporate India, but probably it worked in that time, trying to, for me as an anthropologist, I'm very suspicious of these old, I think it's also what you would call old white men in England, those sort of people who sit in BBC
Sort
board
of
committees and
public school people.
Oxbridge, Oxbridge educated, or people, white old man who has a lot of problems, grumpy.
So that's what you would associate with the term Bhadralok. They have a similar status in Bengali society.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if this is still something that is relevant in their society even today. Whether it is even just, or is it considered to be a kind of a costume just in public life, wearing, like, looking like a moron. I don't know, or it only comes out on few festival occasions. I absolutely. But as I said, I'm very suspicious of all these things. I have never. I mean, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose obviously was political leader, but you see Netaji in various outfits, not just in Bhadralok outfit. He is also seen in modern Western outfits. He's also seen in army outfit.
Sure, but the modern Indian is a bit more savvy, in terms of their international perception as well as their ethnic perception. But I mean, the characters in here, this was a film set about 30 years ago. And what's quite interesting is, for example, Satyajit Ray's first films were very rural. So I haven't seen Padshali, but it's obviously set in a very rural background, isn't it? It's set in a village. And 40 years later, he's come back full circle, and what he's got is a person who's quite ethnic and travelled, has gone back to the city, Calcutta, and come to see and challenge the urban elites with his understanding of, and there's no other word for it but challenge. Utpal Dutt's character openly challenges them with, their sort of very lofty ideals of civilization and all their sort of ideas of advancement. He sort of rubs it in their face and says, I've studied the tribes and I've studied this and that, and I know, that they have a lot of wisdom and a lot of joy. And he sort of rubs that in their face, but in a very humble way, like, you question me, well, I'm going to tell you what I've learned. Which is a very, very interesting angle.
I think so
of this
too.
film.
I agree that one was important towards the end, that he was antagonized and challenged as to why you question our civilized way of life. And I think that is a kind of this push and pull in India's educated elites, because on the one hand there are people like me and that character, who always find these sort of Bhadraloks and urban elites, hiding behind their Indian avatar, Indian ethnic outfits, but still clinging to that, enigma of Western life.
Yes.
And holding the Western ideals and civilized way of life as the most important, ideal way.
Yes.
And not having to look back to, where they, the other side of it. And so I kind of relate with that. And, I have not been really put into the pillar, and asked these questions.
Sure.
Yet, because it's a very different setting, and I don't have ethnic collection, the tribal collections. I didn't go to Gonda Adivasis and ask them, oh, can you give me your anklets and your bracelets, and I will put them in my room. No, it doesn't work like that. You just carry on and you just write a field notes, which he has.
Yes. Utpal Dutt's character has, yes. In this whole film.
Yeah, so I'm kind of that way, intrigued that he was asked to justify his stand as to why you think you're the indigenous people. But I don't see that they were putting. I mean, I had faced this problem even in Panna from the town people.
This is MP
in Madhya Pradesh, on the Gond Adivasi, the tribal population, which I think the second largest probably. Yes. And the town people would say, why do you go and study them? They look at the way they live, look at the way they eat, look at their gender relations, look at their women just out in the public, out and about making, money in front, or disrespecting patriarchy, not starving and all that. And so I felt that, yes, I mean, there is that discourse in India amongst urban elites. And I think that Satyajit did a good job trying to challenge that, to deconstruct that in some way.
Yes.
And it still exists. It's amazing how even today more and more anthropologists coming from India actually still study indigenous people.
Yes.
And they don't study the Dalits communities as much. It's amazing to me.
So to sort of clarify, when you say the Adivasis and these tribes, to just clarify for people who are not aware, that India has a lot of indigenous tribes, a lot of indigenous populations. The Gonds are a big one, the Kols are the ones mentioned here. And these are protected by they're protected by the Indian government, aren't they, essentially? And so the lives of these people is very different to the lives of people in Calcutta, for example. Very, very different. And there's an interesting question. Do you think Satyajit Ray, like a filmmaker who is inspired by, French and Italian realist cinema, who's essentially westernized but also deeply Indian and Bengali, do you think he would relate more to the urban characters in this film or relate more to Utpal Dutt's character? What do you think?
I think he was definitely on the Utpal Dutt side with his antique collections. I think he was confused as well because some of the antique collections were not from indigenous India. They were basically, from, contemporary ancient India. Ancient India, but contemporary ancient India. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
More sort of mainstream deities like Krishnas and all that stuff, the statues,
yes.
Brass and all, which I think is a bit rare in indigenous context. So those collections and the narrative of the movie actually didn't match.
Okay.
The collections were largely about main deities.
Is that the collections that
And
Anita
they are
has?
not, yes, in the house. No, yeah, it's not hers actually, it is her husband
Okay.
who actually, I think, is holding it for. We are never told how he acquired those. Or was he that he was guarding it? Was the government paying it for to be there, kept there? We don't know.
Yes.
And I mean, this is very suspicious because if you look at the Wikipedia page of this movie, which is made in collaboration with the French,
With the Gérard Depardieu
yeah,
and Canal Plus. So he executive produced it, Gérard Depardieu.
so we don't know, what is going on there. Why would he try to show that element? Because you see, the Europeans are very, they have a smell of antique pieces and antique markets.
Yes,
And we have to be suspicious about these kind of things, just showing this to, foreigners. And are we kind to, he could get into smuggling, like he could steal and take it to France and then sell it for God knows how many.
So that's interesting. I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's a very key scene before Utpal Dutt's character visits that Anita hides away the religious symbols into the cupboard? She locks them away. I didn't quite understand why she did that. What did you think about that?
Or maybe it is some sort of a very expensive thing, and if it is lost for any reason, then it will, create a lot of public scrutiny in the family, and it will bring shame. So maybe better to avoid that and just to clock it away. And
Yes.
because she doesn't know this man at the beginning, right? I mean,
She has no idea.
End.
Yes.
So she's still thinking that, she's still in two minds. On the one hand, she thinks he's family member visiting. On the other hand, she doubts because her husband is also not sure.
Yes.
So it's better to not take any chances and just be cautious.
Yes, and all throughout the film, she's mostly not sure about this. And one of the other themes of this film, which is quite interesting, is how her and her husband are terrified of upsetting Utpal Dutt's character, but they really want to know the truth about him. So they get other people to do it for them. They get their friend Pritish to do it, to ask him. And they also get another character, another friend of theirs. And the theme is that they don't want to cause a fuss. They're very educated, but they don't want to get in the face of this guest. They don't want to upset their guest. They would rather have another person ask the questions to him to find out the truth of it. And that leads to that quite amazing scene, which is really the most central scene, which is when Pritish faces off almost against Utpal Dutt's character and kind of pushes him and pulls back.
No, but this is very common in India. In India, you will find two extreme poles. On one hand will be extremely hospitable. Oh, have tea, have sweets. Oh, don't go without eating. Or all
which
those things.
Which is what happens towards the beginning as well, isn't it?
And then there are other people like him who will, just question you right in front of public about your values, about your beliefs.
Yes.
There's no grey area in between. There's nothing like in between in India. There's only the extreme. And there are people like him, British, like who are, pent up with all this energy, which they have not got a chance to,
Yes.
apply in real life. Because obviously such kind of people like Utpal Dutt's character is very rare in India. You don't find people like that who are, very much on the side of the indigenous way of living and who can challenge Western. Because obviously this is a natural trajectory for most post-colonial countries. Okay, now we have to move up forward. We can't look back,
Yes, of course.
So somebody like Utpal Dutt comes and challenges that view. Then this is it's very rare, and so this is for him.
Yes.
That guy British, it's a good learning experience, learning curve. That no, actually, there's another way of looking at it, and that I feel that is very important because so far we have always trusted Europeans to tell us about all this way of living.
Yes.
And we haven't actually done that to our own.
Yes, no, you're right.
I mean, when I went to the Gond Adivasis population and studied their way of living and their what you call ontological understanding of life and cosmologies and all that, I found that very appealing, and I felt more connected and rooted rather than just blindly following what I was raised in urban India and in Mumbai.
Yes.
And I do get very frustrated when I ask questions to my family and elders about things that they do very blindly, like, why to celebrate this Diwali, why to fast on that day, what is significance of this moon, and they have absolutely no idea. They just do it because it's just like blindly they have been drugged into, you know
Well,
so
because it's tradition, and you always do tradition. Like, I mean, in the UK, for example, we would always celebrate Easter. Like, everybody would celebrate Easter. The degree of piousness that they would do, would they go to church? Would they, would they celebrate in a religious way? Or would they just have a holiday and, hide chocolate around the garden? Those are different things, but we would always celebrate them. We don't really have a question in the way that Utpal Dutt's character questions, So maybe that's a sort of like a tonic, like sort of cold water thrown in the face of these urban people. Like, why do you believe what you believe? What is the real reason for this? But it's also very interesting because, in the UK we don't really have such indigenous populations. Whereas in India, I imagine there's a kind of a very interesting push and pull between your identity connected to these indigenous people and your idea of progress, of let's progress, let's move forward, let's urbanize, let's modernize, but also we have a very traditional society with lots of people who, have very traditional beliefs, rural beliefs. And I think that's what he's trying to do in this film, is trying to force the two worlds to come together and to accept each other in a way.
Yes, I think you're very rightly pointing in the right direction that, yes, the concept of indigenous was never applied by the colonizers for their own. This was a concept largely applied for Indians and for, their colonies. There was no equivalent of Gond Adivasis or something like of that nature, at least in their time in England. And even today, I don't think that concept can be applied for any aspect of British life.
Very little.
And so, yes, I think that is for me, who's interested in the idea of indigeneity and indigenous, this makes a lot of sense, because there are people in India, like, some people working on this as to what is indigenous. Because will I be an indigenous for British people? Because I am indigenous. But for me, if you ask me to understand the term of indigenous and apply, it is the Gond Adivasis who are indigenous. I don't see myself indigenous. But for British people, I am indigenous.
Yes, we don't make a distinction. You're all Indian.
So I feel that this actually clarifies a lot of things for me as well as we're talking, because I think it is the coloners, the upper caste Brahmins were very clear right from the get-go during the colonial times that we are not the indigenous. We are the Brahmin community. We are the upper caste. We are the Hindus. We are already the civilized. It is, if you want to study indigenous, then yes, you go to the forested people who live on the. But then there are so many communities in Britain who were living in forests as well.
Yes,
and,
of course.
And they were never associated with, the whole of, I don't know, the Welsh people, what we know, those big warriors and all, they were all forest people. The Robin Hood thing is all about forest. He always lived in the forest. He was it's a real. I don't think it is a myth. Robin Hood did exist, isn't it?
Well, it's a myth. We haven't really proven he's a mythical character like King Arthur. But what is real is, for example, we do have indigenous languages in the UK, which have mostly been superseded by the English or Welsh in Wales.
Yeah, and
so
you dare
Cornish
not use...
and Manx and things like that.
And you dare not call Cornish and Welsh and Scots as indigenous. You just consider them as part of UK. Because you will, because they will just reject the idea that the main, Anglo-Saxons are upper caste Brahmins or urban elites or whatever. Why? Because they had to sort about a war, isn't it? They had to fight against the Scots and the Welsh, to conquer them, to Irish to conquer. So obviously, it was not like they were fighting guerrilla warfare. They weren't. They were fighting like equivalent battles.
Sure.
They had the same weapons that the Welsh people had, or that whole thing about the Braveheart. He was a
that's
Gaelic.
Scottish, Scottish.
It looks tribal to me, the whole color on his, cheeks and whatever it was, the blood of whatever, I don't know what it was on his cheeks and his face.
But the difference
That
in
looks indigenous to me.
well, it is indigenous, and that's a whole angle of that Mel Gibson film. That is part of the sort of the reason that it was made in that way is like of the indigenous Scots versus the oppressing British, the oppressing English. However, the politics of that film are very thorny, and I'm not really going to try and untangle it, especially since I've only barely watched it. But I mean, I want to come back a little bit to this film and what I've enjoyed a lot about it. I mean, one other thing that I really greatly enjoyed is obviously Utpal Dutt.
Yes,
Who
very
is
entertaining.
Amazing in this film, and he was previously in Golmaal, which is translated as Hanky Panky in English, which we've seen, and his role in this is quite similar, but he gets to stretch out a bit, and you can see that he's having a lot of fun with this role, but also finds it very serious and getting into the nooks and crannies of it, because he's a very complex character, the one that he's playing. He's at the same time someone who's very foreign, but also profoundly Indian, because he can recite the names of Krishna. He's someone who's very funny, but also has to be very serious, because he's constantly cross-examined. He has to be very worldly, but also very humble and personal, because people are pushing him, interrogating him. So it's obvious this background that he has, because he has done Shakespearean plays at Utpal Dutt. He is an actual trained theatre actor, and you can see him showing his range in this, and it's wonderful to watch. What did you think of his role in this?
Yeah, he's like a big uncle, and uncle that every household should have.
Yes.
Who's very well travelled and brings knowledge of outside world. As a kid, you want to have an uncle like that. My God.
Oh yes.
You feel so safe with people like this. Who just so generous in just sharing their knowledge and.
Yes, and the little kid loves him, doesn't he? The little kid who's really...
Yeah, he's completely heartbroken at the end.
Yes, although we won't reveal why,
Yeah.
but it is lovely. The relationship between the two of them is lovely. He was just great in this whole film, and I thought the whole scene where he was being interrogated by British was just wonderful, and that brings to another thing that I really enjoyed about this film was the direction of it, and very differently to his other films, which are very external, this one was very interior. So it was all about the house, and it was all about how the house was both a space to invite and to discuss. In that, what's that cultural tradition they mention? The talk sessions, in a sort of talk session manner.
Charcha.
Yes, but also in a kind of interrogating manner, and that one scene was so sustained and so in your face. It was wonderful to see the camera panning between them, and Ray deliberately showed their faces up front as they were sort of confronting each other. And I loved how damning it was that Anita and her husband barely say anything in that scene and just let British talk and attack, because they're too proud to try and then later they think, oh no, we shouldn't have done that. He is a guest. So you have that push and pull, they're like, well, on the one hand we want to know who he really is, but on the other hand, should we have been that cruel towards him? He's a guest. And that was really quite a lovely... It humanises them as well towards the end, Anita and her husband. They become very human after that encounter, which is quite a lovely scene. So I quite enjoyed this film. I didn't think it was up to the standard of The Adversary, which was my favourite film of his, and I look forward to watching more of them. But was there anything about this film you didn't enjoy?
Well, it's hard to think, but I think that there was some issues just with the normal consistency and but overall it was okay. I think some of the things were just I think this was probably based on some real life events, or not very 100%, but something like that similar, because it seemed a bit factual to me about the whole wills aspect, that
that lost me a little bit, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just wanted some more clarification about the collections that guy had. in the beginning, where he got it from and what was the context. I mean, obviously they were rich but not very wealthy. To have those collections in your home without any government protection raises like, okay, it's private collection, but then how did you acquire it? And and also, yes, I think that they were shown to be extremely high class people, obviously. Yes, that is fair enough. It's okay that that kind of life maybe they did live very, but still they were austere. The curtains were very plain. The furnitures weren't very elaborate in terms of
Yeah, true.
pine wood and all kind of thing that we see in Delhi. Everything seemed to be very bland. Her
Yeah.
choice of ornaments and sarees were also very very regular. It didn't feel like they were
No, you're
upper
right.
class, except that they had two servants and they had a car and
Yes, you're
but
right.
I'm just still doubting if that is exactly how people actually lived at
In
that standard. I think that they had very big homes in Calcutta. They had French windows, that sort of. I really miss that sort of. Because Calcutta is the only place in India where you can shoot all these old heritage sort of buildings and homes.
Have you been to Calcutta?
No, I mean, as a young kid, yes. But, you
Too
require
young
to
to
be
remember.
more, yeah, you require. All I remember about my visit is the Kali Ghat temple and seeing a, goat being butchered or whatever.
Oh, blimey, wow.
For as a sacrifice to the goddess. That is the main thing that I remember. And the other thing is just the smell throughout the city of of mustard oil, because they eat fish a lot.
Oh,
So
you love
wherever you go, you just smell
mustard oil.
mustard oil everywhere.
And fish.
And the tram.
And the tram. Oh, okay.
I don't know if Calcutta still has trams, but in those days, 20 years ago, it was still a reality of part of. Again, Satyajit never, I don't think, has ever shot anything in a tram. Or any of these guys have actually, which is weird.
It'd be interesting to see if there are any sort of tram settings, or really, what would be more interesting for me would be to see if he's made any other films which are like purely urban Calcutta films, because a lot of his films are mostly about the struggle between, from what I've seen, the 3 films I've seen are about the struggle between urban and rural, or mostly about rural life. So it'd be very interesting to see if there are any ones which are entirely set in Calcutta or a city. I'd love to see that. Yeah, and just as a little thing based on what you said culturally, towards the beginning, when Utpal Dutt arrives in the house, he gets served by the family, and he finds these very ornate candies and sweets and lots of rice and lots of fish, and that you had quite a strong reaction to that scene. You quite enjoyed that scene, I remember.
Yeah, again, their food is so ethnic.
Yes.
I mean, the kind of food that people in villages also will eat, they will also eat. That way Bengal is that way very weird, because even though when they move to the urban areas, they still eat the same food that a villager would eat.
Yes.
That is not the case in North India. When they move to city,
Yes.
diet also slightly gets adjusted.
Yes.
And people will eat naan bread and instead of just roti.
Yes,
Or they will
absolutely.
consume more of these oily breads than just normal, roasted types of breads which they eat in villages. The more of the meat consumption increases.
Are those the ones you've served me?
That is what I serve you. That is what we eat. Mughlai style North Indian.
Oh, yes.
No, Bengali cooking is different. Bengali cooking is not as greasy. I think it's less bit greasy. It's definitely not as spicy.
Yes.
And the gravy is not as thick.
Yes.
Because it is designed to be eaten with rice. So you can't have gravy which is too thick.
Oh, no.
And lentils, and that is everyday feature, which is common in North India. But again, it is not seasoned enough. It is sort of mostly left boiled with little bit of only cumin seed. I think that is also probably an urban thing. Maybe in the villages they just serve it boiled only.
So what did he eat in this one? What was he
split
serving?
lentils.
With a bit of rice he had as well.
Yeah, and fish. Fish is the main thing. Their specialization is fish.
Yes.
Very weird cooking style, and they don't use coconut.
And
It's mostly tomato based.
And that scene was quite important also because it sort of showed Utpal Dutt's characters very he has to maintain this understanding of the urban traditions that he's been accepted into. He has to show politeness and understanding, and also during that whole scene, Anita is sort of assessing his Bengali. Is it good Bengali? Is he speaking good Bengali? And then she gets on the phone and says to her husband, "Oh, his Bengali is very good. Yes, you know." So in that scene, he's almost like being interrogated, even though he's just eating a meal, which is very interesting. I very much liked. And all throughout, he has to smile and be happy and all that. Now, in terms of one or two things that I didn't like, I didn't think this was not at all the fault of the film. I think it was the print of the film. For some reason, the print or the version of the film, the audio immediately stood out as being quite distorted and quite low quality, especially compared to something like Race that we watched last time. The audio was definitely crackly and analog, almost the same quality of something like Awara back in the 50s. And whilst the direction was wonderful, it did sort of distract from me a little bit because the film was so dialogue heavy. It was sometimes difficult to follow the dialogue because the sound quality was quite, distorted sometimes and a bit hard on the ears. That's not really a fault of the film at all. The film was great. It was a very, very good film. It's just about the print, which I felt could have been a better... Well, I don't know what's available, but it was just one of those things that distracted me a little bit. So yes... I think we've had a very beneficial discussion. I think this is a wonderful film, and I definitely recommend that you see this. Did you have any final thoughts on this film?
Yes, I mean, just enjoy the collections, and the character is unique. I think this is one of those movies where you will find Indians in defense of the ways of life for indigenous people, which is fabulous. Yes. Otherwise, normally we always find Europeans doing that for Indians, so that is good.
Lovely, yes. I would agree with that. My final comment would be, if you are very interested in watching a late period Satyajit Ray film, this is a very good one. I might not start with this one. I might start more towards his middle periods, because the two other films that I've seen have been better, but then I don't think I've seen any weak film of his among the three that I've watched. So you might just go for this one anyway. In terms of Utpal Dutt, I would say this is a wonderful performance, and I definitely recommend it. If you like Utpal Dutt, you should definitely see this. It's a wonderful little film, and it's definitely worth seeking out. So yes, this is our first film that we've done in Bengali, our first Satyajit Ray film. And if you've enjoyed us talking about this film, then please leave us a comment. Please drop us a line, because I'd be more than happy to cover other films like that. It'd be very interesting to watch more of his films or more Bengali films. If you are interested, please drop us a line. We're on Twitter at BanterBollyB, which is our handle. We're also on Instagram at BanterBollywood and Beyond. And you can drop us an email at banterbollywoodandbeyond@gmail.com. And we also have a Facebook page, which is getting a few more likes these days, so that's great. And that's just Banter Bollywood and Beyond. So you can just search that and you can find it. And please leave a comment and share this podcast if you've enjoyed it. The main thing that we want really is a sort of communication. Did you respond? Did you react to any of the themes that we've been, have you seen the film? Did you like it? What do you think of the points we raised? What we really want from this is not so much whether we have 5 listeners or 2,000 listeners, but like what you respond, how you feel about the things that we've raised, discussion of the movie and the culture that came from it. So until next time, that's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
And stay safe.
Stay safe.
And cue theme tune. Bye.